Okay, so welcome everybody for our third class plugging away into Zionism. So I want to start off today with a little bit of a story. It's a story that not many people know about early Zionistic history, and this involves what is now dubbed the Milchamot HaSefaot, or in English, the War of the Languages. And this is a ideologic battle that happened internally within Zionism. And I just want to paint a little bit of the picture of how fierce the fight, not just between the Zionists and anti-Zionists was, that we saw last week in the early 1900s, but even within Zionism, it was not, everybody all on the same page plugging away until 1948. There were huge debates and huge difference of opinions of what exactly people's view of what the state would be, what does Zionists stand for, and also, again, circling around this fundamental question that we've been asking the entire time: is Zionism a movement of rupture or continuity? So we're going to come back to that a lot today. But this story happens in 1913, and actually not in the land of Israel, but actually in Vienna, because many offices of early Zionists happened within Western European institutions, right? This we know. Most of the early Zionists were from Western Europe. And this was right at the time when the Technion, what would now become, still the top engineering school throughout Israel, right, churning out, hundreds of thousands of inventions a year. They were about to open the new Technion, and the very simple but ideologically important question of what language would classes be taught in the Technion. Again, this is 1913. There still wasn't really a fully developed language of Hebrew, but it had already been slowly developing for about 15 or 20 years after Eliezer ben Yehuda, who we'll talk about in a bit. And there were essentially two camps that rose in what was now known as the Battle of Languages. One camp were the, proper Western Jews who said, of course, if Israel is going to be a modern nation state and is going to be well respected and is going to be a Western country, the only reasonable language to have instruction is, of course, German, right? This is the language that educated Jews speak, right? If you remember back from last week, it was Germany, which was the home of the Reform movement, of the conservative movement, of the modern Orthodox movement, right? It was Germany that was a home to many of the original Zionist thinkers and Jewish socialistic thinkers. So, of course, if you're going to create a Jewish state that's modeled after Western nation states, you pick the language that is the sort of the fanciest of Jewish languages, the language of Jewish intellectualism and Jewish philosophy, right? That was the German camp. There was then a smaller group that, of course, over time started to gain steam that said, no, the language, of course, needs to be Hebrew, right? It doesn't make sense. You're going to go to your ancient homeland and you're going to speak an exilic language, right? The whole point of Zionism is to reclaim some ancient component of Jewish identity. Why are you sticking with Germany? So this came to a headway in 1913, where there was a German language Zionist newspaper that was printed all throughout Jewish communities in both Western Europe and in the land of Israel. And again, their job was to put out Zionist periodicals and Zionist philosophy in German, right? The language that most highly educated Jews spoke. So one night in 1913, a group of Zionist youth who were affiliated with the Hebraic camp actually snuck into this newspaper factory and firebombed it and blew up the entire thing. Nobody was actually killed, right? They specifically waited till everybody left. But this is seen as, the apex in what was a multi-decade debate. And this debate's not just about language, right? This is why I wanted to start with this very interesting case. This debate is obviously about something much more fundamental about Zionism and what would eventually become the state of Israel. And one way to put it, right, if we look at it from one side, we can ask ourselves, is Israel or is Zionism a modern, liberal, democratic, Western-like nation state, right? That's one view. Or is Israel some ancient reawakening of some Jewish cultural, spiritual, historical state that, maybe it happens to be aligned with the West, and it happens, its politics might happen to be liberally democratic, but that's not actually what the core of Israel and Zionism is. So needless to say, this is the debate that we'll be focusing on today. I want to start with a couple of what I think are the main questions, because I find this interesting. And again, for those who know me by now, which I think is everybody here, right, I really like thinking of history and ideologic movements through different tensions. So questions, right, our meta question that we're going to come back to. I started the first class with this, but again, I think this question really is the key to understanding all confusion around Zionism, of which there is much everywhere you look, which is Zionism a movement of continuity or a movement of rupture, right? That's our question in the background. We'll come back to that later today. We'll come back to that at the end of class next week. The second question is, and it depends on the first, of course, but what should the nature of the Jewish state be, right? Is this a state that is fully modern and any inklings of Jewish traditionalism are just sort of leftover baggage that we want to, thrust off as quick as possible? Or is Israel or Zionism attempted a new episode in a storied Jewish traditional history? And so another way to put this, and this is going to be the main debate between what eventually becomes the cultural Zionists versus political Zionists, is this question. Is Zionism about Jews or Judaism? And we'll come back to this question in about 45 minutes. But one way to put this is Herzl, right? This is a little bit overly simplistic, but I think it holds about 95%. Herzl cared about Jews, right? Herzl, and before him, Moshe Hess, right? Everyone we read last week, all the first generation of political Zionists, they saw trouble, right? Jews based on their innate characteristics as Jews, right? Moshe Hess talks about race, and Herzl is also talking about, right, this endemic anti-Semitism, right? Moshe Hess writes, even Jews who convert, you can't convert out of having a long nose, right? That's one of his most famous lines. And so they clearly were worried about a type of anti-Semitism that they thought was just inherent within the West, right? Whether they're right or wrong, you can debate at home. And so in order to protect against that, Jews just need political power, right? Now, both Moshe Hess and even more so Herzl, they didn't really care much about Judaism, right? If Jews would have been allowed to assimilate into Western Europe, they would have taken that option, as would most educated Jews in Western Europe. Then came along a second generation of Zionists, and these are many thinkers that we're going to look at today. And while they disagreed on what the Judaism that was brought into Zionism needs to be, argue that Zionism can't just be about Jews. It also needs to be about Judaism, right? There has to be a spirit of either traditionalism or Jewish culture, or if we talk more about, the religious Zionist community, religiosity and messianism infused within Zionism. So this is going to be our big question today. And within this question, right, we have two categories that we'll discuss, which is, if Zionism is about Judaism, right, is this about physical Judaism? Does Judaism need a change in terms of its outward mechanics or in terms of its internal ideologic mechanics? And I'll give very concrete examples in a little bit. So one, I want to start with Eliezer ben Yehuda, who's writing in the 1880s. Again, this is even before the first Zionist Congress and before Herzl. That wouldn't happen for another few years. But the cultural Zionist push predated, in some sense, the political Zionist push. In other words, I said last week, and I think everybody understands what I mean when I say this. Last week, many of you probably didn't know what I mean when I say this. Anti-Zionism predated Zionism within the Jewish community, right? I'm talking about in the modern component, right? Obviously not, ancient ideas of returning to Israel. But in the early 1800s, most Jews were trying to assimilate into their various nation states, and we can call that anti-Zionist because they were explicitly saying, we don't think Judaism is a nation anymore, right? This was explicit in the early Reform movement. It's also implicit within the conservative movement and even the modern Orthodox movement of Samson Raphael Hirsch in Germany. He also said, Judaism does not need any claim to a piece of physical land, right? Our land, the land of Israel we talk about, is spiritual, not physical, right? And so anti-Zionism predates Zionism, but I also want to make the argument that cultural Zionism predates political Zionism. What do I mean by that? Another enlightenment that didn't of Hebrew literature, Hebrew poetry, and this focus on Hebrew literature and poetry predates much of the mechanics of people actually trying to get together and build a state. So I want to just focus on Ben Yehuda for 1 second. I'm going to guess most of us have heard of Eliezer ben Yehuda. If you haven't, you've at least been on Eliezer ben Yehuda Street, because every major city in Israel, one of the main thoroughfares is Ben Yehuda Street. But he's writing a letter to his wife in 1880, and he says as follows: I have decided that in order to have our own land and political life, it is also necessary that we have a language to hold us together. That language is Hebrew, but not the Hebrew of the rabbis and scholars. We must have a Hebrew language in which we can conduct the business of life. It will not be easy to revive a language dead for so long. So Ben Yehuda was not just, a fascinating ideologue because of his commitment to Hebrew, right? He was that. My favorite Ben Yehuda story, by the way, is that he raised his children with their first language being Hebrew. And at the time, they were the only people in the world who spoke Hebrew, right? So you can, imagine all sorts of interesting ideologic commitments that would take to raise your children with a language that literally nobody else in the world speaks, right? But that was what it took to reemerge Hebrew from essentially the Bible and a bunch of Jewish codes and Jewish prayers. But also in the ideologic sense, right? This question of, is this true? Right? Is this letter true? Right? I think this is a really interesting question to just focus on for a second. Is it true that in order to have your own land and political life as Jews, you need to reemerge an ancient language? Right? That was certainly what the early cultural Zionists pushed, but you can imagine the pushback. You can imagine people like Herzl, who strongly disagreed with Ben Yehuda, by the way. Herzl writes an essay in response to Ben Yehuda, essentially saying, can you imagine how ridiculous it must be to think that we can order a train ticket in a language that was once used for, the Mishnah and Bible, right? In other words, for him, it was crazy. It was like, if I were to say, let's reinvent, hieroglyphics and let's run a modern economy based off of that, right? It's almost fantastical. So the political Zionists, right, again, their entire goal was just political autonomy and protection for Jews. So they didn't care about the mechanics, right? They were happy to model Zionism off Western nation states and just essentially create a copy of Germany or France or England in the Middle East. That's explicitly what Herzl wrote. Another group of Zionists that comes up parallel to Herzl starts to say, no, if you're going to reemerge, if you're going to invent or create a Jewish state, the state can't just be the fact that it's a bunch of Jews who are in charge, or maybe there's the right of return, or, you actually need some cultural Jewishness to this place. And this starts with language, which again was why throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, this battle of the languages ended up being one of the most fierce debates between these two camps. Now, obviously Hebrew won, right? Nobody is still arguing for German being the central language of Israel. But this gets a little bit of a glimpse into a debate that I want to dive much deeper in today. And I want to do it by introducing one of the most interesting Zionist theorists. He's not usually one of the, top 3 or 4. So I'm not sure. I'm going to imagine there's probably a mixed reception of people knowing who he is. But that's Max Nordau, who from the outset of Zionism was right there with Herzl, but ends up giving his own address to the First Zionist Congress in 1897. And he starts off by repeating all the mantras you would expect that Herzl would agree with, and then ends up taking a very sharp turn. And so I'm going to do something that is terrible pedagogy, which I would never do if I was teaching a bunch of college students, which is put a lot of text on a slide, which I know the second you do that, especially on Zoom, it's like everybody's out, but I'm going to trust that we can handle a good amount of text. And so Max Nordau is giving a speech at the First Zionist Congress, and don't worry, I will read it. I won't make you read it. But this is also a perfect summary of last week. And so just to start from the top, he says, emancipation has altered completely the character of the Jew and made him into a new creature. As a complete aside, I was talking with a group of students last week, and I realized none of them had ever read Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. And I had a group of, about 6 or 7 AEPI guys sitting with me at Starbucks, all reading the Metamorphosis. And at the end, I was like, all right, we'll discuss. What do you think it is? And everyone was giving their different theories. And then nobody picked what I think is the most obvious one, which is Kafka's writing in Germany in 1915. He's Jewish, and he's seeing how the image of Jews is going from being this, nice liberal, of course Jews have rights, to slowly being demonized and turned into vermin, which I think was probably Kafka's point. But Max Nordau is giving this speech in 1897, and he said, emancipation had made Jews into a new creature. And then he says as follows: the Jew without legal rights in the period before emancipation was a stranger among the peoples, yet he did not think even for a moment about rebelling against this condition. He felt himself to be a member of a special tribe that had nothing in common with the country's other inhabitants, right? So this is exactly what we talked about last week. or 2 weeks ago, Jews in the pre-modern period had no rights and they lived in Jewish enclaves, but that was just the entire reality that they knew. If you were to go back to talk to your great, 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 great Jewish grandparent who lived in anywhere in Europe, and you were to say, well, what about equality and human rights, right? You might as well be talking about, aliens and artificial intelligence to them, right? These ideas just were not within the ethos or zeitgeist at all. And Nordau saying, essentially, maybe this wasn't good for Jews, but Jews were able to withstand this, right? It was fine, right? He goes on to say he did not like the little yellow patches Jews were compelled to wear on their cloak. By the way, many people think this is originated with Nazi Germany, but about 1,000 years before, both in Christian and Islamic lands, oftentimes the way that Jews were designated as Jews is by wearing a little yellow patch. The Nazis, of course, just borrowed it, as they did with a lot of anti-Semitic ideas. And so he writes, Jews didn't like wearing this yellow patch because it was an official invitation for the mob to commit brutalities approved in advance by the authorities. Yet he freely insisted upon his peculiarity more strongly than any patch could have done. In other words, Max Nordau says, Jews were still being Jews, right? In other words, yes, they were being singled out to being Jews, but also there was something in the Jewish mentality. And again, he's going to opine on whether or not he thinks this is good or bad in a second, but there was something within the Jewish mentality that said essentially, you're right, we are different. We're proud of being different. If people are going to not like us for being different, so be it. So he goes forward and he says, whenever the authorities did not wall him into a ghetto, he erected one for himself, right? In other words, right, we think of the ghetto as this big wall that, say, the Italian government sets up and Jews can't go beyond this ghetto. Nordau's pointing out that for most of medieval and pre-modern Jewish history, Jews essentially erected their own ghettos, right? He wanted to dwell with his own people and to have nothing other than business relations with his Christian neighbors. In the word ghetto, there are now connotations of disgrace and degradation. The racial psychologist and historian of culture recognize, however, that the ghetto, whatever the people might have intended it to be, was felt by the Jews of the past to be not a prison, but a place of refuge. In other words, Jews within the ghetto, they had a clear picture of the world, right? Maybe it wasn't great, right? None of us would volunteer to go back to some pre-modern ghetto, but he writes something that I think is really profound, that the switch of emancipation wasn't an unadulterated good for Jews, that within the ghetto, Jews had their identity. They were able to practice Judaism freely. There was none of this conflict of modernity that emancipation and enlightenment thrusts upon Jews, right? Then he says, through an irony of history, it was only the ghetto that made it possible for the Jews to survive the appalling persecution of the Middle Ages. In the ghetto, the Jew had his own world. It was a secure homeland for him, the intellectual and moral equivalent of a fatherland. Here were the companions by whom one wished to be and could be valued. Here there existed a public whose favorable opinions was the goal of those ambitions for honor, and whose deprecation and displeasure was the punishment for disgraceful conduct. Here all qualities were distinctively Jewish, were esteemed, and by their specific development one could gain that admiration which is such a powerful spur to human action soul. What did it matter if these things that were prized in the ghetto were scorned in the outside world? In other words, when Jews were in the ghetto, when Jews were in this pre-modern period, there wasn't all this tension of, do you assimilate? Do you reform Judaism? Is Judaism a religion? Is it an ethnicity? Do Jews want a state, right? All of this confusion of Jewish modernity that is both happening in the late 1800s, and I'll also add is happening in the 21st century, right? None of this really applied to pre-modern Judaism, right? In some sense, and again, some could fault Nordau. I'll put on my very academic hat for 1 second. Some could fault him for, doing the classic, this is the myth of an idyllic past, right? So, not everything was this rosy and great and, everybody was together as one big community, right? That's for sure not the case. But at least in terms of Jews understood their place within the world and society, right? So he's delivering this speech at the First Zionist Congress. And you can already tell, right? He's talking about Zionism. He's talking about political Zionism, right? He's definitely on board with the need to create a Jewish state, but he's starting to change a little bit, right? He's talking about Jewish culture a little bit more than he's talking about Jewish protection, right? He goes on, and I'm gonna summarize. We don't have to read all this text. He then says, legal emancipation came, and this came with a honeymoon period where Jews just rushed out of the ghetto, right? You can almost imagine this comedic scene of someone knocking on the door of a ghetto in, I don't know, 1807, pick your favorite Western European country, and saying, okay, Jews have full equal rights now, and Jews are just running out the door and leaving behind their identity, their tradition, right? Judaism, the religion, everything behind them, and just running to assimilate into the mainstream. And so just to read the end of the sentence, I think this is a very powerful line. He says, the Jew could believe that he was really just another German, Frenchman, Italian, like all his other countrymen, and was drawing, like them, from the same deep spring of national community in a measure essential to the full development of the individual soul. So at some point, modernity and emancipation threw Jews this facade, right? He calls it, or illusion, which is you don't actually need to be Jewish anymore. You can be fully enriched and immersed by your natural culture, right? Whether you're French or English or Italian or, obviously in the modern context, whether you're American, right? What do you need attachment to some ancient Jewish identity? Certainly not any nationalistic identity, right? And then Nordau says, well, this was great, but after about 30 to 60 years, right, anti-Semitism in Western Europe broke out again and was actually worse, right? And this is something that Herzl writes about as well, that Moshe Hess writes about it as well. And so now Jews are sort of stuck. And he continues and he says, when Jews are stuck, this is actually even worse than you think, because at least in the pre-modern age, when Jews were stuck, we had our religion to rely on, right? When Jews were stuck in a pre-modern period, we would come together as a community. We would fast, we would pray, we would deeply observe the rituals, right? You have the famous line, also from another early Zionist thinker, by the way, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews, right? What does that mean? It meant that despite all the terribleness that happened to Jews throughout history, we had our tight-knit community and social bonds and relationship with God and relationship with the calendar, right? We had our community, right? It's not to say that it was all rosy and amazing, but there was a certain amount of nostalgia that, when you look at Fiddler on the Roof, I don't know, to pick an example, you feel for the tight-knitness of that community and, obviously the incredible dance moves with wine bottles on people's heads, right? And he says that in modernity, right, there's a problem because Jews have traded in Judaism for modernity, right? This is a two-step argument. It's a fascinating argument. Jews have traded in Jewish identity for modernity because they thought that was going to give them equality. And yet modernity turned out to be a broken promise. Jews were not treated equal. So now Jews are left without either, right? Jews don't have political equality, right? They're not treated as German nationals or French nationals, and Jews don't have their faith anymore, right? Jews, right, just to look at the second line, they no longer have that faith which gives them the patience to endure sorrows because they are acknowledged of the providence of a chastising but nonetheless loving God. They no longer have the hope that the Messiah is coming and will continue to raise them to a day of miracles, right? So Jews are stuck. They don't have their tradition that kept them going over thousands of years, and they don't have the promises that they were hoping to get by trading away their Judaism. And so he has the most interesting line, right? This is a term that Max Nordau coined, but that many early Zionists are going to use as well, which is Marano, right? Just a brief history of the term Marano. Marano is not a politically correct term, so typically people don't use it today, but Marano literally means swine or pigs, and Marano is the term that was given to Jews during the Spanish Inquisition who retained their Jewish identity, but covertly. In other words, in 1492, the Spanish government issued this ultimatum, the Alhambra Decree, and said any Jew that wants to remain in Spain or Portugal has to convert to Catholicism or else we're going to kill them. And so many Jews left, right? This was the great Spanish Sephardic exodus from Spain and Portugal. Many Jews probably converted to Christianity and never, skipped a beat, and they haven't, their family didn't find out about it until 23andMe tests are now widely available, and people from South America are all of a sudden realizing they're 15% ethnically Jewish and being surprised about it. But some small number of Jews, again, by definition, we don't know exactly how many, said, well, okay, I'll just do both, right? I'll profess Christianity in public, but I'll retain a covert Jewish identity and continue to practice Judaism on the downfall. What Max Nordau says is that Jews who are throwing away their Judaism in return for some acceptance that never happens is what he calls a new breed of Marranos, which is far worse than the old one, right? It's a fascinating insult. Just to read this last paragraph, the medieval Marranos had an idealistic streak, a secret yearning for authenticity, consisting in heartbreaking pangs of conscience and regret. And more often enough, they sought atonement and purification in premeditated intentional martyrdom, right? So Max Nordau has a lot of respect for the medieval Jewish Marranos. But the new Marranos, he says, take leave of Judaism with anger and bitterness. But in their hearts, even if unacknowledged by themselves, they also resent Christendom for their own degradation and dishonesty and the hatred which has forced them to live a lie. I shudder for the future development of this new race of Marranos who are without the moral moorings of any tradition, whose spirits are poisoned with enmity towards their people as well as foreigners, whose self-respect has been destroyed by the ever-present consciousness of a fundamental lie. In other words, Nordau is saying the Jewish community in Western Europe is becoming a new type of Marrano, right? In other words, they're attempting to publicly profess, we're not Jewish, we're French, we're German, we're whatever. Internally, they're still Jewish, of course, because, you can't give up, an entire community's Jewish identity that easily, but Jews are stuck, right? They don't actually have an identity and they're living this sort of dual existence. So Nordau, of course, like a good political Zionist that he is, right? Obviously, it's going to be obvious what his solution is, right? It's going to be that the only way we can account for both of these, the loss of faith and traditional Jewishness and the loss of political rights, is in the form of a new type of nationalism among Jews. But that nationalism needs to come with a completely reawakening or creation, again, you can kind of pick and choose which adjective to use, of a new type of Jewishness. Because Jews can't rely on that old faith that we have because, like most Zionists, Max Nordau just didn't believe that anymore, right? Max Nordau did not believe that one day a Messiah was going to come and bail out the entire Jewish community and bring them back to Israel. Neither did almost any of the other Zionists. So Max Nordau then comes home from the Zionist Congress, spends a couple months, and ends up writing a pamphlet that he dubs Muscular Judaism. And here's just one excerpt from Muscular Judaism, and then I'll talk about the concept in general. So he says, the history of our people relates to the fact that we were once strong physically, but today that is not the case. Others succeed in degenerating us physically. They had the ghetto Jews of the Middle Ages into sorrowful weaklings, haggard and unable to defend ourselves in the narrow alleyways of the ghetto. Nobody can deny us the necessary physical activity needed to make our bodies healthy again. We will renew our youth in our aging years. We will develop wide chests, strong arms and legs, a brave look. We will be warriors. What is lacking physically, we will develop through exercise. But our recovery to health is not only through the body, but also in the spirit. For as Hebrews attain more achievements in sport, so will our self-confidence improve. Long live sports. Hebrew sports clubs go forth and bloom. So Max Nordau is writing this late 1800s, and he's essentially saying Zionism can't just be a shift in a couple of Jews or even the majority of Jews, but in the beginning, they were not talking about the majority of Jews living in Israel. Even Herzl thinks that it's only going to be a small percentage of Jews, right? Zionism can't just consist of Jews living, some Jews living under political autonomy in Israel, right? That was Herzl's view, but that's not Max Nordau's view. Max Nordau was calling for a complete switch or evolution of how Jews all across the world begin to see themselves, right? And just to take a couple of steps back, I was going to kind of go over this idea later, but if you take a moment and if I were to ask, who is a Jewish hero, right? However you define hero in your head, before 100 years ago, right? And I were to just ask, who is a Jewish hero or who is a Jewish warrior, right? It's a really interesting question, right? This is the exercise that early Zionists were giving themselves, right? I'm going to imagine, and if I'm wrong about this, I would love for somebody to unmute or write in the chat or, straight up tell me I'm wrong. But I'm going to imagine if I ask you to think of a Jewish hero in your head or a Jewish warrior especially, you're not thinking of anybody between the years of 150 CE and 1900 CE. In other words, there's going to be a 1800 year gap if I were to say, think Jewish hero or Jewish warrior, right? Hero, I'm not talking about intellectual hero necessarily, but, somebody who, seems heroic, seems strong, seems warrior-like, right? I see someone wrote in Emma Lazarus, right? I'm not talking about, poetic hero or political hero, but somebody who, our classic depiction of warrior or heroic figure, right? Think, Hercules type figure, right? You don't have anyone, right? What was right? You would have to go back to the Hebrew Bible or back to the Maccabean period. This is where I always joke that there's a reason why every Jewish sports team is called the Maccabees, right? And why the Jewish Olympics is called the Maccabiah, right? Because we don't really have anyone else to pick, right? Who are you going to be? The medieval, Talmud commentators or the medieval, exegetes or the medieval philosophers, right? That doesn't make for a great basketball team name, right? And so essentially, Nordau's point is that Jews for about 1800 years forgot what it was like to be physically developed, right? That the Jewish hero of the Middle Ages and pre-modern period, and, just to pick on whoever typed Emma Lazarus there, right? I think that was a great suggestion, but was intellectual, right? In other words, if you were to think of who the great Jewish figures of the medieval period were, you're going to think of people like, say, Maimonides, right? Maimonides is a great first guess. I have my cup here that a student made for me last year. What would Maimonides do? Because he's one of my favorite Jewish thinkers, right? But Maimonides, we don't know anything about his physique, right? We know that he was, he wrote a lot about medicine. He wrote a lot about philosophy. He wrote a lot about law, right? He was sort of a nerd's nerd, right? And we love that. And, every Jewish intellectual institution and half the hospitals that were opened by Jews in America are called Maimonides Hospital or Rambam, right? That's great. But that's not going to be the, strong, fearless person who you want to defend you, right? If you're alone at night in an alleyway, as Max Nordau was sort of implying, and you are looking for somebody to protect you against a gang who means harm to you, you're not thinking, oh my God, I really hope that some guy who's both a doctor and a lawyer can, come protect me, right? You want the guy with, big arms and a strong chest and knows how to wield a weapon. And the reality is, and the problem for Jews in the early modern period is that archetype did not exist. And it didn't exist almost, and, I was going to get to this on a future slide, but I'll just say it now. So maybe I'll, fast forward here. It didn't exist by specific social, I'll say manipulation. It sounds bad, but I don't mean it in a negative way, but specific manipulation by the rabbis, right? When I say the rabbis, I mean the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud and medieval leaders, right? The rabbis of the Mishnah, right? We're talking 2nd century CE, right? Who is strong? Someone who controls their desires. In other words, the rabbis are suggesting that when we talk about strength, we're not talking about physical strength. We're talking about some emotional strength or spiritual strength, right? The rabbis go further. The rabbis all throughout the Talmud and medieval Jewish literature, and I didn't want to bore you all with countless examples, so you'll just have to take my word for this. I'm happy to provide footnotes and receipts for this at some later time. But the rabbis in the Talmud and medieval period consistently dismiss physical strength. The rabbis have a concept in the Talmud. It's known in Hebrew as Ol Torah, literally translated to the yoke of Torah, right? A yoke is what you put on an ox when you're about to use them in the field, right? In other words, the rabbi's understanding of Torah is that Torah actually limits your physical capabilities, that you actually make yourself weak. And there are countless stories in the Talmud of rabbis, as they begin to learn more Torah, become more and more physically weak. In other words, the rabbis were purposely painting a picture of masculinity that was the real masculine, right? What it means to be a real Jewish man or a real Jewish gibor, right? Strong man, is to be somebody who is very religious and very nerdy and very law-abiding and everything like that. The rabbis specifically, right? My favorite example of this is Hanukkah, by the way, right? We can talk about Hanukkah. It's coming up in a couple weeks. The rabbis attempt to erase Hanukkah, right? What do you mean by the rabbis want to erase Hanukkah? So a couple of proof points. One, the book of Maccabees was not accepted into the Tanakh / Hebrew Bible, and that was the decision that the rabbis made. The book of Maccabees, if you read it, it's all about a huge war that erupts between the Maccabees rebelling against the Greeks, right? The book of Maccabees is one of the most militant books that we have in Jewish history. The rabbis, not only do they not give that book sacred significance, right? On Hanukkah, we don't gather together to read the book of Maccabees, even though we probably should, right? And every other holiday, right? On Passover, we read about the Exodus, and on Purim, we read the book of Esther, right? So why on Hanukkah do we not read the book of Maccabees? That was a conscious decision by the rabbis to say, well, we don't want people reading the book of Maccabees. Why? Because when Jews did read the book of Maccabees, they revolted against the Roman Empire, like the Bar Kokhba revolt that happened in the year 137 CE. And it was a catastrophe, right? We talked about this a little bit in the first class. In the year 137 CE, a Jewish strongman general named Bar Kokhba rallied 100,000 Jewish troops to revolt against the Roman Empire, and it was a colossal failure. And so the rabbis' entire project was to minimize the military and physical attributes of Judaism. With Hanukkah, the rabbis basically ignore Hanukkah, right? It's actually a big question. Hanukkah does not appear in the Mishnah, right? There's an entire tractate of Mishnah for every Jewish holiday. There's one for Sukkot, there's one for Passover, there's one for Purim even. Purim barely has any laws, right? But for Hanukkah, there's no mention it in the Mishnah. And when it's talked about in the Talmud, the only thing the Talmud says is the story of the miracle of the lights, right? There's no mention of the war that happens between the Maccabees and Greeks. That doesn't come into Jewish literature until much, much later. And so the rabbis, and what Max Nordau's point is, and this is a picture of Max Nordau over here on the right. You can see the big bushy beard, right? Just like Herzl, they all had great beards, right? All of the Max Nordau saying, in order to change the sentiment of Jews in modernity, it's not enough to just have a state. We actually need to change Jewish culture into bringing back the machismo or the muscular nature of Jews of the past. So Max Nordau's movement of muscular Judaism was instrumental in a huge component of Zionist history. It's hard to overstate how important this is, which is a reclaiming of past Jewish figures and symbols, right? A couple examples. Maccabees is the obvious one. The Maccabees were not talked about positively in religious Jewish literature, right? The rabbis do not talk about the Maccabees in a positive way, right? They ignore the Maccabees, right? All of a sudden now, every Jewish kid talks about the Maccabees, especially in Israel, right? Israel's obsessed with the Maccabees and culture associated with that. Another one is Masada. What's Masada? I'm about to lead a bunch of students on Birthright in 5 weeks, so we'll be back at Masada. Masada is a Jewish fortress that is in the desert that was the stronghold of a offshoot from the main Jewish community in the year 70 CE. They're known as the Zealots. And the Zealots were a vicious group that actually spent much of their time killing other Jews who were less religious than them, right? They were literally zealots, right? When you think of religious zealots. Josephus writes about this. Philo writes about this. The early rabbis in the Mishnah write about this. None of them like the Zealots. But the Zealots are also known for refusing, when the Romans destroyed the temple and Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, most of the Jews in Jerusalem essentially laid down their arms and said, okay, Jerusalem's destroyed, the temple's destroyed, let's try to continue Judaism elsewhere. So the famous story of rabbinic Judaism is a couple of rabbis moved to a small town called Yavne and create the Mishnah and allow Judaism to switch from a land-centric, temple-centric Judaism to a book Judaism, right? The Judaism we practice today in Orange County, right? It's very book heavy, right? We're very into learning and very into, Torah study and Talmud. And if you're more traditional Jewish law and all that, right? The Zealots said, we're not bowing to the Roman Empire. They keep fighting. They fight their way down to this massive fortress that was built in the Roman period named Masada. They all climb up this mountain. And as the Roman army is enclosing on them, they commit a mass suicide of hundreds of people and kill themselves, essentially, because they said, we would rather be dead than submit to someone else's political autonomy and control, right? The Romans were not going to kill them. The Romans were just going to take them and subject them to Roman society and Roman culture, right? But they said, we'd rather die than do this, right? Masada was not considered a happy or good chapter of Jewish history until the Zionist movement. But early Zionists located Masada and said, well, this is a real symbol of Jewish strength and Jewish forgiving, a Jewish refusal to give up, right? The same with Bar Kokhba. And so the first step of this fascinating inflection point that began to be this, Zionism plus, I'll say, was this idea of having to inject the physicality and militance back into Judaism, which again would take a lot. I'll do one more quote. I'll introduce one more thinker, and then I'll take some time for questions, and then we'll talk about the flip side of this debate in a second. But Zev Jabotinsky, who ends up becoming one of the most famous Zionist thinkers, he actually is considered the father of what becomes revisionist Zionism, which ends up giving birth to the modern Likud party. So think, that's the party of Benjamin Netanyahu. It's the party of Ariel Sharon. It's the party of, I don't know why I'm forgetting his name. The first, I'm completely blanking here. This is what happens when you have a little sleep, but somebody will get it to me. The first right-wing prime minister of Israel. Somebody will type it in the chat. He was from Eastern Europe. I can picture him and hear him speak now. I assume somebody will get that in 1 second. But Zev Jabotinsky, Menachem Begin, there we go. See, didn't even have to wait for you. All right, Menachem Begin was in Zev Jabotinsky's party. And so Jabotinsky writes in his essay, right, he's very much carrying on the tradition of Max Nordau. And this is great because he's using a Talmudic concept. So he says, to imagine what a true Hebrew is, to picture his image in our mind, we have no example of which to draw, right? In other words, I'll paraphrase. I want to create the ideal Jew, right? And he says we actually don't have any pictures of the ideal Jew, right? Because from his view, the entire Jewish community is existing in such a sad state that we actually don't have a picture of the archetypical Jew. So he says, instead, we must use the method of Ipcha Mistavra, right? Ipcha Mistavra is a Talmudic logical concept where if you don't understand something or if a concept is difficult, you try to understand it from its opposite. So let's say, I don't know, let's say I wasn't able to understand what it meant to be cold, right? So you would explain to me, imagine being really hot, and now imagine, the opposite of that, right? It's something very different than being very hot, right? It's a logical concept. Logical concepts used within their legal debate. So he said we have to start with the opposite. What does he mean? He says we take as our starting point the Yid of today and try to imagine in our minds his exact opposite, right? So he says, picture your average Jew. Now imagine the exact opposite. That's what we're trying to create, right? He says, let us erase from that picture all the personality traits that are so typical of a Yid, and let us insert into it all the desirable traits whose absence is so typical in him, right? And here he goes, right? Get ready for this, because if this wasn't Jabotinsky writing this, you would swear this is anti-Semitism, right? He says, because the Yid is ugly, sickly, and lacks handsomeness, we shall endow the ideal image of the Hebrew with masculine beauty, stature, massive shoulders, vigorous movements, bright colors, and the shades of color. The Yid is frightened and downtrodden, so the Hebrew ought to be proud and independent. The Yid is disgusting to all. The Hebrew should try to charm all. The Yid has accepted submission. The Hebrew ought to know how to command. The Yid likes to hide with bated breath from the eyes of strangers. The Hebrew with brazenness and greatness should march ahead to the entire world, look them straight and deep in the eyes, and hoist them his banner, I am a Hebrew. In other words, right, this is such a fascinating essay by Jabotinsky. He's essentially saying, listen, the diasporic Jewish world has created, or, the mixture of medieval Jewish situation with modernity has created this picture of the Jew who's, downtrodden and refuses to stand up for themselves. And right, again, both Nordau and Jabotinsky, this is important to say, are writing before the Holocaust, right? Post-Holocaust, by the way, this is one of those things that, I don't think we talk enough about, but it's very much continued within the same intellectual tradition. For the first 20 or 30 years of the state of Israel, there was almost zero Holocaust remembrance at all. The state of Israel essentially wanted to ignore the Holocaust, and when they did acknowledge the Holocaust, it was not quite victim blaming, but it was, see, look, this is what happens when Jews refuse to stand up for themselves and Jews don't have an army, right? It wasn't the, obvious respect that we show today, right? And this very much is continuing in the image of Jabotinsky. Again, they didn't know the Holocaust would happen, but they were writing after many of the pogroms that were happening in Eastern Europe, and they're essentially watching Jewish community after Jewish community be ravaged and destroyed, and the Jews are still not learning how to shoot and work out and everything. And, the religious Jews are, still praying to God, and the liberal Jews are still, saying, well, don't worry, any minute now, liberation and progressive values or the socialist revolution will come along and save us. And people like Nordau and Jabotinsky are saying, you guys have got to be kidding me, right? Like this, we need to do the exact opposite of this. We need muscular Judaism strong. And in Jabotinsky, right, the reason why he's called the revisionist Zionist is because he's attempting to tell the story of Jewish history through the story of Jewish strength and Jewish downtroddenness. And so this was a huge movement. And just to finish this off, and then we'll pause for some questions, right? We get one of my favorite quotes by Joseph Trumpeldor, who was also an early labor Zionist. And he, again, talks about the need for Jews to change their identity. Always talking about labor, right? Again, just to paint a little bit of the historic background, right? I'm a lot more interested in the ideas than the history now, but I think the history is interesting to sort of scaffold the ideas. Many of the early Zionists, right? It wasn't, it's not like today. It's not like you fly into Ben Gurion Airport and then you can take a taxi to your favorite, I don't know, 4-star hotel with a great breakfast laid out, right? This is sort of obvious, but many of the early Zionists, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s, really were going to a desert with very little water, and there was malaria everywhere, and there really were swamps everywhere, right? It's not to say there wasn't, also Jews and Arabs living there. There were clearly people living in major cities like Jaffa and Jerusalem, but the vast majority of modern day Israel literally was nothing. I mean, I think I showed you all that picture of Tel Aviv, what it looked like before they broke ground. I mean, it literally looked like, you're in the Mojave Desert, right? It's literally just sand dune after sand dune with no natural water and no natural resources. And so having people go from their lives in Western Europe to actually be willing to commit to building the Jewish state was a big push, right? So Joseph Trumpeldor is talking about, again, the need to remold the Jewish idea. And so he's talking about this idea of being a pioneer, right? This was a huge motif in early Zionists, in Hebrew, it being a chalutz or the chalutzim, the early pioneers. And he says, what is a pioneer? Is he a worker only? He says, no, the definition includes much more. The pioneers should be workers, but that is not all. We need people who will be everything that the land of Israel needs. A worker has his labor interests. A soldier, he has a spirit de corps. A doctor and an engineer, their special inclinations. A generation of iron men, iron from which you can forge everything the national machinery needs. You need a wheel, here I am. A nail, a screw, a block, here, take me. You need a man to till the soil, I'm ready. A soldier, I am here. Policeman, doctor, lawyer, artist, teacher, water carrier, here I am. I have no form. I have no psychology. I have no personal feeling, no name. I am a servant of Zion, ready to do everything, not bound by anything. I have only one aim, creation, right? This is again, just a fascinating glimpse of the psychological morph that, right? And this is at once, I think, beautiful and troubling. I think, I saw some faces grimace when I read this, right? You don't have to like this necessarily, but to understand what many of these early Zionist thinkers, especially in the vein of muscular Judaism, is essentially they were trying to say Jews completely need to reinvent themselves, right? The old model of Jewishness just isn't working. This will be the last thing I say before I'll take a couple questions, then we'll go to the flip side of this debate. But this is why I believe the most interesting tensions throughout the Jewish world today are still between Israeli Jews and American Jews in terms of a lot of these things, right? The sort of nature of Israeli Jews of, say, not really caring what anyone thinks and saying, who cares? We just need to be stronger and whatever, right? This is in direct intellectual lineage from many of these thinkers. And on the flip side, the disposition of many American Jews who we constantly are asking ourselves, again, for better or worse, what will everyone think? Or how will this reflect on us? Or what will the news say? Or what will these institutions say about us if we overstep, right? That's a very, in Max Nordau's, lexicon, that's a very diasporic way of thinking, right? Again, I'm not here to call up balls and strikes necessarily, but the early Zionist muscular Jewish thinkers, right? Their project was a full-scale renovation of everything from Jewish physique, right, in the muscular Judaism, to Jewish intellectual habits, right, to even just the morphing of the Jewish spirit into something concrete, right? Jews will be able to refine their identity, right? This is Trumpeldor's point, the Jews of modernity have no identity, right? That's the premise of Max Nordau. And so their identity is going to become state building, right? Going to become Zionists. And so this was the muscular Jewish push. Would love to hear any and all questions. Michael asked why Jabotinsky's message didn't resonate with the Polish Jews, right? That's sort of the $1 million question is why these, why many people who ended up perishing in the Holocaust, didn't heed the warnings. And the probable answer is they were still in the minority. Even in 1920 in Western Europe, Zionists were very much the minority. And most people just didn't believe them, right? They still thought that things would get better and that any day now, right? We saw the essay from Hermann Cohen last week, who talks about Germany as being, the messianic time. And he's writing that, I forgot exactly what year, but it's like 1915, 1916, 1917, right? It's very hard to go from thinking you're living in the messianic era to in 10 years being like, oh, we're not just a little bit wrong. We thought we were living in the best society in the history of the world. It's actually the worst, right? It's a very tough psychological switch. By the way, I'll only add because, I'm guessing half of you are thinking it right now. This is exactly what, if you ask your average Israeli, they think about diasporic Jewry today. And so, right, if you go to your average Jewish community, right, and again, I'm not here to, this is actually something I'm personally conflicted about, so I won't even give, both of my opinions, which are on opposite sides of this debate. But if you ask your average Israeli, they would say, well, Jews outside of Israel, right, maybe it's not as bad as Germany in the 1920s and 30s, but certainly things are bad. And why don't Jews heed this? And why aren't Jews banding together and, fighting back physically and everything like that? So it is very much, I think, a historic parallel as there. So yeah, you're 100% right. And that sort of is the big question. By the way, the Zionists were essentially begging Jews to not just join their cause, but to also leave Western Europe. So much so, and there was a breakoff movement from Jabotinsky's camp, right? He was the revisionist Zionist, an even more extreme breakoff that was known as the Stern Gang by a guy named Abraham Stern. And he actually, in the early 30s, was attempting to engage in diplomacy with the Nazis to essentially say, hey, you guys clearly don't like Jews, right? That much is clear, right? They hadn't issued the final solution yet. By the way, just one note on the term final solution. We talked about the Jewish question last week. The reason why Hitler called it the final solution was because it was answering the Jewish question, right? So that's why it was called solution. But Abraham Stern was trying to engage in negotiations with Hitler to essentially say, well, just give us all the Jews. We'll send them all to, at that point, British Mandate Palestine. And you'll be great. You'll be completely free of Jews. And so, right, obviously that deal didn't work out. But, right, the revisionist Zionists, especially the revisionists, were essentially willing to do whatever it took. I mean, that essay by Trumpeldor, I think, is, spot on, right? They were willing to do anything, right? If that is negotiate with the British government, great, we'll negotiate. If that is blowing up the King David Hotel to put pressure on the British government to allow more Jews to be able to immigrate into British Mandate Palestine, okay, I guess we're going to blow up the King David Hotel, right? Not all Zionists. That was the revisionist Zionists as well. So, I think Dare is right also that, it was a higher proportion of German Jews left, right? It was mostly the Jews who hadn't fully embraced modernity yet, and a lot of traditional Jews. I mean, again, this is sort of one of those things that's, again, I don't want to give, I don't want to moralize this, but a disproportionate amount of Orthodox Jews were killed in the Holocaust as well, because again, there was a refusal to engage at all with Zionism. And so, whereas at some point, many Jews who were previously liberals or socialists either became Zionists or immigrated to America, many of the Orthodox leaders in Europe were saying, of course, don't be Zionists, and also don't move to America, right? This is a very underrated chapter of American Jewish history, because America was deemed the Treifa Medina, right? The non-kosher state, right? The idea of America is you come to America, you have to work on Shabbat, you stop eating kosher, and then your children marry Christian, and then you're assimilated, right? It's partially true, by the way, right? So I don't want to, it's not that the Orthodox community was wrong, but, great Orthodox leaders were essentially saying, don't leave. And then, as Dara said also, of course, there were economic considerations as well, right? Moving massive families. But for all those reasons, right, if somebody knocked on the door of a Polish shtetl and said, hey, we're going to go join the Zionist movement, right? There would have been a lot of reasons why they would have been pushed out. Matt, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just gonna say like I find it very interesting that especially in the first Zionist Congress, there seems to be a lot of Western thought. And it's great, and I think they make a lot of great points in terms of especially Jewish muscularity, right? But I think Ahad Ham, right, especially in the reading that you assigned from the last class, it is very interesting because there's a diagnosis of like the Western Jew and the Eastern Jew, right? Which is the Eastern Jew has more of a material problem, right? Even the basic necessities such as food, and the Western Jew is more of a cultural identity issue, right? And whether or not the answer is just the state itself, right? The establishment of a state, which, that could look like Germany or France, right? But I feel like Hom takes the stance where it's like, no, it needs to be cultural. And he kind of sides with the rabbis too in terms of opposing the muscularity. Because it seems like the answer to him is more spirituality and building a culture with the language and all that stuff. So I think it's very interesting to see that play out.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, we'll talk about him in like 5 minutes. Yeah, he is the counterweight to this, and also the roots of the modern day Israeli right and left. Right. I mean, back when there was sort of a real debate between the Israeli right and left, I'm talking about in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the intellectual roots of the right were all the sources that I just showed you, and the intellectual roots of the left were Ahad Am and and others in his camp. Just one more note, and then Ray, I'll take your thought or question in a second. When Ahad Am talks about East versus West, he's not talking about Middle East versus European. He's talking about Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, right? Again, right? It's a very interesting thing that Ahad Am is doing because the Jews of Eastern Europe had not been emancipated yet. And so for them, they are just poor and they're weak and everything like that. And they don't even have emancipation to look forward to. But many of them were still deeply traditional. So Ahad Am is sort of, he merged the Eastern European Jewish community with the Western European Jewish community. And until Ahad Am, Zionism, or at least the ideologic nature of Zionism, was a very Western European phenomenon. Ahad Am brings in the Eastern European component. Ray, go for it.
So the shift into hypermasculinity, testosterone poisoning, that had infected the development of Israel, and that it ends up that the Israelis had a very difficult time dealing with the Holocaust because first it was not discussed, and that the people that came out of the camps who were in terrible physical condition, and so that until fairly recently they were not dealing with a thing. And so in the poetry and in the literature you begin to see uh, the immense impact that later on it gave, and that even to today the role of women has been downplayed. um, of course, I'm a woman, I'm a feminist, but that the October 7, some of the great mistakes were because people would not listen to the reports that women gave of what was going on. And so there needs to, that I don't know if there's a more balancing now, but it's a poisoning that this attitude had done to that society.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I'll take both the comments. I think, well, let's talk about the feminism first. It's interesting because a lot of these early labor Zionists were actually pushing for somewhat of an egalitarian. I mean, I obviously they're using the language of male, but on many of the kibbutzim, this was actually the first time in Jewish history where women were expected to pick up a shovel right alongside men, and there were all these fascinating cases of that. So, but you're right. I think when it comes into a culture, um, obviously, I think it's going to be set there as well. So I think the point is well taken. I think again
But
for yeah.
what about dealing with the Holocaust? Actually, um, incorporating what has happened to the Jewish people of act and looking at it And the Holocaust. When did the Holocaust Remembrance Day begin to become an event?
I believe
I don't
after the
know.
Eichmann trial, it really took until I think 1961. I think that was the Eichmann trial, where it really even emerged in any significant way on the Israeli conscious. And I think again, it's one of those things that seems crazy and seems sad. Again, it's hard to imagine the counterfactual of just the Zionists were, you know, fighting with everything they had, you know, tooth and nail to the war in terms of the internal war against the Arabs, and then also from being attacked on all sides. And so, you know, their entire identity of Jewishness was in, you know, exactly what Jabotinsky says. Like they define themselves as, we are not the Jews of the diaspora who went like sheep to the slaughter. Again, I'm not saying that, you know, normatively. I'm saying that descriptively. So it's sort of, I mean, it makes sense according to their own philosophy that they wouldn't center, you know, the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors. I mean, Holocaust survivors were treated pretty badly by Israel in 1950. I mean, again, not nearly as bad as anywhere else in the world, but like they were put in, you know, essentially, you know, large, you know, camps, and they weren't really given much, you know, government funding for things, and they weren't really recognized on any national level, and anything. There, I see you. Do you disagree, or are you frustratingly reacting to? So I'm curious. Do you have a Okay, never mind. So essentially, Israel wanted nothing to do with like large scale Holocaust remembrance. And again, it took until 1961 and the Eichmann trial, and for it to really come on, and even the world stage. I mean, again, same with, in some sense, same with the American Jewish community. Obviously, they weren't trying to reject the memory of the Holocaust, but it wasn't even clear how bad things were in the late 40s and early 50s. And, you know,
Can you hear
American
me?
Jewry. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I didn't know if you could hear me before. I don't think that's a very fair characterization as at all. You have to remember at this time that this is a very tiny country that's very poor, and they had to accommodate, you know, how a million people coming in from Europe. Then they have to accommodate this mass immigration of the Mizrahi Jews. And Daniel, I want you to interview my mom because she came during this period and was put into, what was the name of that camp? Um, it's a camp that's right on the Atlit. My mom was in Atlit, and she just, you know, they had food, they were given apartments. My mom had an apartment that was right on the border of East Jerusalem, but folks were completely traumatized. She was put into school. She had an incredible schooling experience, but it was a poor country. I mean, these were people who came absolutely broken with nothing to a country that had very, very little. So I think your characterization is historically absent of what it was like to be in that country at the time. And I think you should talk to her about it.
It could be on a personal level. I do know nationally there really wasn't any large scale attempt to commemorate the Holocaust, right? There was this huge debate in the 1950s about, you know, even accepting reparations from Germany that implicated this. I think sometime in the 1950s, there was what's called like the Castor trial, where there was this huge case in Jerusalem for, it was a Zionist group who tried to work with Hitler, kind of what I was saying before, to attempt to sneak Jews out. And the Zionist defense essentially was that, you know, this classic idea of Jews going like sheep to the slaughter. So you're right in terms of they weren't mistreated, right? I'm not saying they were negatively treated when they got there, but there wasn't the type of, you know, nationalizing. I mean, now when we think of Israel, I mean, Yad Vashem is sort of one of the most obvious symbols. And every time anyone goes to Israel, you know, politicians or groups, you know, go to Yad Vashem. But Yad Vashem wasn't built, you know, in the early years
Yeah,
of
but
Israel.
you're again, like we didn't build a 9/11 memorial the year after 9/11. I mean, it takes time for a country to solidify around a message. And every day the newspaper would print stories of people who are either, you know, found, who are lost, who are killed. Like my mom said, every Friday night they lit, you know, the whole country, people lit candles and looked at, for who was, I think, again, like, I really wish you would talk to her, because
Is this before 61
this
that
is
she's
before
talking about?
61. My
Because
mom,
60.
my mom came in 1948.
Okay, no, but I'm curious if she thinks of this as a before 61 phenomenon or after, because it really changed during Eichmann.
Well, so let me think. When she left, she was 17 when she left, and she was born in 44. So 64, she left in 62, 62, 63. So I don't know if she has I don't know what her opinion would be after that, because she didn't live there anymore.
Interesting. No, I'd be curious to talk to her about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, I don't want to harp on this too much. It's pretty well documented, this situation with Israel and Holocaust remembrance. So maybe I'll try to send you some stuff in a little bit. If anyone else has comments, you can feel free. But I'm just using this as an example of the general idea, and this idea is still present, I think, to Rhea's point a little bit, in Israeli society, where it's not. I mean, victim blaming is too strong of a term. It's not victim blaming, but it's, here's an example. If something terrible happens to a Jewish community in Europe, I'm talking about now, not, 100 years ago, the Israeli response is, oh my God, that's terrible. Jews should all come to Israel, right? What are Jews still doing in Paris, right? And that sentiment, I think, is, right, we can reflect whether or not that's right or wrong, but that very much, I think, comes from this labor muscular revisionist type of Zionism that, again, it's hard to fully disagree with them. I mean, I think by dint of the fact that most of us in this call are Jews who live in America, right? I think we also probably somewhat disagree with the full totality of the point. Otherwise, there would be somewhat of an irony of us still living in America. But I think this is the interesting tension, but I do want to make sure to bring in Chadam and then Dara. We should talk about this later, because I'm curious to compare notes here. But Ahad comes in, and essentially he is also in the first Zionist Congress, and he is listening to all the speakers, right? He's listening to Herzl and Max Nordau's speech and everything, and at some point he gets a sense that nobody is talking about what he considers to be the most obvious pressing problem of Jewish modernity, which is not Jewish defense. Right? It's not protection against anti-Semitism. It's not reinvention of the Jewish, warrior spirit to ensure that we're well respected and feared on the world stage. But it is Judaism. And he has this famous essay that Jen writes a couple months after the first Zionist Congress, called The Jewish State and the Jewish Problem, where, like any good Zionist thinker, he has to theorize on his own problem. So again, for Herzl, and for many of the early Zionists, right, that we just saw, the problem is that Jews are weak and Jews can't protect themselves, and anti-Semitism is bad, so we need to figure out a way to protect against all that. Ahad starts off with this very famous line, right? I think it's a fascinating line, because he says it's not only Jews who have come out of the ghetto, Judaism has come out too. In other words, he's saying, modernity wasn't just a, physical trauma and, a identity thing in terms of individual Jews, but also Jewish tradition is also under attack. And he goes as follows. He says, for Jews, the exodus is confined to certain countries and is due to toleration. But Judaism has come out of its own accord wherever it has come into contact with modern culture. Right? So Ahad is saying there's an entirely different problem here of Jews and modernity that we haven't been talking about at all the last two classes, which is Judaism's contact with modernity, not individual Jews. So he says the contact with modern culture overturns the defenses of Judaism from within, so that Judaism can no longer remain isolated and live a life apart. So he says, right, and this sounds a little bit similar to Max Nordau, right, but he takes us to the next level. He said, when Jews were living in the ghetto, right, Jews were in control of everything, right? Obviously not their own political safety, but if you wanted to decorate the streets for Hanukkah in the ghetto in Venice in the year 1700, sure, of course you can. Or if Jews wanted to change their governance structure, again, it was rabbis in charge. So there was a certain amount of creativity that was lended to the Jewish community in the pre-modern period that modernity took away from the Jewish community, right? So he says the spirit of our people strives for development, It wants to absorb those elements of general culture which reach it from the outside, to digest them and to make them a part of itself, as it has done before at different periods of history, but the conditions of its life in exile are not suitable. In our time, culture wears in each country the garb of the national spirit, and the stranger who would woo her must sink his individuality and become absorbed in the dominant spirit. For this reason, Judaism in exile cannot develop its individuality in its own way. When it leaves the ghetto walls, it is in danger of losing its essential being. Right? So he's saying in modernity, different communities are just adopting into the cultural norms of the mainstream, right? What we might call assimilation. And he says Judaism, in order to reach its full potential, right? He's implicitly arguing with the Reform movement here, by the way, and also essentially conservative and modern orthodoxy, but mostly the Reform movement, right? Because the Reform movement in early 1800s Germany said Judaism's just a religion. Judaism can adopt to whatever host country and accept that nationality. And so in America, Jews can be fully American who happen to practice a religion called Judaism. Echad Ha'am says that's missing the whole point of Judaism. Judaism's not a religion. Judaism is this much wider thing, right, that he ends up calling a culture. And so he says, when Judaism leaves the ghetto walls, it is in danger of losing its essential being, or at best, its national unity. It is in danger of being split up into as many kinds of Judaism, each with a different character and life, as there are countries in the Jewish dispersion, right? So he diagnoses perhaps the exact problem the Jewish community in America is today, where he says, listen, when Judaism's in the diaspora or in exile, it's just going to split up into ever more types of Judaism and different denominations and different communities, and the Jewish community is going to become ever more splintered around ideological ideas. So then he concludes, and I'll paraphrase this, right? He says, in order for Judaism to actually thrive, Judaism needs a cultural center, right? And this cultural center, just to read the last 6 sentences, and then I'll unpack it, because I think this is the 6 of the most prophetic sentences written by a Zionist thinker. So he says, this Jewish settlement, which will be a gradual growth, will become in course of time the center of the nation, wherein its spirit will find pure expression and develop in all its aspects up to the highest degree of perfection which it is capable. Then from the center, the spirit of Judaism will go forth to the great circumference, to all the communities of the diaspora, and will breathe new life into them and preserve their unity. And when our national culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident that we'll produce men in the country who will be able, on favorable opportunity, to establish a state which will be a Jewish state and not merely a state of Jews, right? That last one is the most important line. And just to unpack this in the last couple minutes, and I'll take some final questions. Echad Ha'am is saying Israel can't just be a state of Jews. It can't just happen to be a state where Jews live there, whatever those Jews are, whether they're warriors or, whatever, politicians, doctors, but we need a Jewish state, right? Zionism needs to be infused with a certain amount of Jewishness, not just for physical safety of Jews. Echad Ha'am cared less about anti-Semitism, right? He thought anti-Semitism was less of a problem than the political Zionists. That's the one big knock against Echad Ha'am. But the big plus of Echad Ha'am, and I always like to, give a modern example, where Echad Ha'am, essentially, I've anyone who's heard me talk about Echad Ha'am has probably heard me say this exact line, but Echad Ha'am predicted things like birthright, right? What's birthright? You take a bunch of American Jews whose entire Jewish identity is being in some suburban synagogue that they don't really go to except for their bar mitzvah, and they probably haven't been there in 4 or 5 years, and Judaism for them is maybe Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and, maybe some special foods eaten on Passover, right? It's a very shallow identity, right? I'm giving a broad diagnosis, but for many American Jews, especially in the 1970s and 80s, this was the case, even more so if we go back to 1920s and 30s. And Echad Ha'am is saying, Judaism is going to continue to be increasingly diluted in the diaspora unless there's a cultural center that can reinvigorate it. What does a cultural center look like? It means, again, a center that Judaism can fully evolve on its own accord. What does that mean, right? Jewish Israeli poetry, Israeli literature, right? Even the Israeli legal system. The Israeli legal system, by the way, is a fascinating mixture of modern Western law and also Jewish law, right? Jewish law actually right, in the early 1950s and 60s, there was an entire movement called the Mishpat Ivri movement that attempted to essentially synthesize British law and Talmudic law and create the scaffolding for the modern Israeli legal system. It's also one of the reasons why Israeli law is so complicated and subject to debate, and you always have such a mess in terms of Supreme Court debates. But putting that aside, Ahad Ha'am is saying, this is exactly what the Jewish community needs. It's not just a massive bunker in the Middle East, which is kind of what you get when you read the muscular Jewish thinkers of we just need, more protection and more fortresses. Jabotinsky in the 1920s writes a famous essay called The Iron Wall. If you've never read it, highly recommend it because it's sort of the classic manifesto of revisionist Zionism. It's very powerful, and perhaps he's even right in what he writes in The Iron Wall, right? That's for you to decide, but he's not talking about Judaism, right? Ahad Ha'am is saying, if we want Jews to actually survive, if we want this project of building a state to survive, we have to also rescue Judaism, right? We can't just rescue a bunch of individual Jews, because if we do that, then really what's the point, right? One interesting thing, just because Matt said this before, and then I'll take some questions and thoughts, is Ahad Ha'am is at this point the first Zionist thinker that's coming from both Eastern Europe, and he also grows up in a religious Jewish community. He grows up Hasidic. His name is Asher Ginsburg, right? His pen name is Ahad Ha'am. Ahad Ha'am literally just means one of the nation, right? So it's just his pen name. He obviously renounced his, Hasidic beliefs, but he brings a lot of, Hasidic type thinking into the Jewish state. Not to mention, for Jews in Eastern Europe, most of them were still pretty traditional. So the idea of just, having a modern German nation state in the Middle East, right, wasn't very palatable to a lot of Eastern European Jews who still wanted a lot of Jewish culture and Jewish tradition and even some subset of Jewish law. And so Ahad Ha'am essentially accuses the Western Zionists of being elitists that are out of touch with the rest of the Jewish community. And he says, this is why no one's listening to you, right? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but you can kind of read this if you read his full speech and then his full essay afterwards, where he's saying, this is why nobody's listening to you, because you're out of touch. You're talking in this, high-minded jargon about nationalism and anti-Semitism and protection. And meanwhile, most of the Jews in the world at this time were living in Eastern Europe. They were not living in Germany and France. And so he says, if you really want this to work, you have to speak in a language that most Jews are going to understand. And you also have to rescue the thing that most Jews still care about, which is this whole Judaism thing. You can't just thrust off 2,000 years of Jewish identity and completely reinvent yourself into something new. You have to bring that in. And here comes, again, the very hard work of navigating this, of, again, going back to our question from the beginning of, is Zionism a movement of newness or oldness, right? Is this a reinvention or an invention of something like a muscular Jew, of maybe an archetype that existed 2,300 years ago, but certainly not anything that would have been recognizable to our great-great-great-grandparents and our thought experiment of, from the first class of you popping into a time machine for 500 years ago, right? So the muscular and labor Zionists, right, they essentially were happy with Judaism being completely severed from Zionism, because in their mind, Judaism was the root of a lot of these problems, right? Again, a lot to say in unpacking that, but they hold the rabbinic tradition culpable in a lot of ways. And, maybe we'll might have to check in with Dara's mom for this as well. But if you look at the early Israel education system, this is actually still true in the early education system, and you look at what the majority of Jewish studies is centered around, it's not the same thing that if you went to a American Jewish day school and took Jewish studies. If you go to a, let's say traditional American Jewish day school, you spend a lot of time reading rabbinic literature, right? Mishnah and Talmud and medieval Jewish thought and Jewish law, halacha, and medieval Jewish philosophy, people like Maimonides, and the poetry of, the medieval Ashkenazi Jews, right? If you go to Israel, there's a focus on Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Bible, right? Because these are the stories of rootedness in the land. These are the stories of military victory, from the judges to, Samson to Joshua, and, all the wars that are happening there. And so this is, again, the tension that's between the Ahad Ha'am and the labor Zionists, which is the labor Zionists are essentially saying the 2,000 years of Judaism in exile was a mistake, right? That was bad, right? We're, yet it was important in the 9th century to have, Jewish law and the Talmud and rabbinic Judaism. That was a good placeholder to keep Jewish identity going until we can, reemerge in its natural state, right? It's, Hebraic state of what Jabotinsky calls the opposite of everything Jews were in the medieval period, right? That's one view of, yes, we're rupturing because the entire exile was a mistake, right? The other view of Zionism, the Echad Ha'am view, is no, this is an attempt to actually resuscitate what was lost in Judaism in modernity. In other words, it's not medieval Judaism that was a problem, but it's the last 80 years since the Emancipation and Enlightenment that, okay, there's a little bit of crisis of meaning and innovation and creativity within Judaism. So great, Israel will be able to absorb and fix that problem by infusing specifically Jewishness into the character of the state. And so again, you get this, at every stage of Zionist history, right? Whether now we're talking, first class we started by talking about, medieval Jewish thought of messianism and going to the land, all the way to this first to second generation of Zionist thought of, is Zionism a movement of continuity and rupture? You get people on both sides, right? And this is within the Zionist community, right? We're not talking about anti-Zionist now, or certainly not, non-Jewish anti-Zionist, right? That comes way later. But even within Zionists, if you were to go to the first Zionist Congress and, go around with a notepad saying, are you trying to continue Judaism, right? Maybe with some tweaks, or are you trying to completely break away from this? You would get a 50-50, maybe not 50-50, but you would get a real split. And again, all these tensions go into questions in the modern day Israel, right? Questions from, should Jewish law be observed in the public sphere, and what role the rabbinut and the rabbinate should play in public Jewish life, and whether or not Israel should explicitly define itself as a Jewish state. What does that mean, right? Does a Jewish state mean that it just happens to be ethnically majority Jewish? Or does a Jewish state mean that it's infused with Jewish tradition and Jewish culture? This is still a debate within the Israeli public sphere right now about what we even mean when we say we want a Jewish state. What Echad Ha'am meant when he said a Jewish state was not necessarily a state that has an ethnic Jewish majority, right? He might not have been opposed to that necessarily, but what he was saying is a cultural center of Jews doing Jewish things that can breathe creativity into the rest of the Jewish community. When Herzl says he wants a Jewish state, he meant a state in which the majority of people, especially that are in charge of politics and the military and police force, are Jewish. These are two very different visions of what a Jewish state is. So even within the Zionist movement, which again, this is, we kind of went a little bit between 1896 today and 1920, Zionism was still a minority movement within the Jewish world. You have this tension that's brewing, which is, again, a fascinating tension that still has never really been solved. So happy to hang out for any and all questions. I see that there is a long question in the chat, so I'll read that. And then if anyone else has thoughts or questions, would love to hear it.
I just want to thank you. This is really a great series. And so when somebody walks up to me and says, "Are you a Zionist?" and then I say, "Well, you have to tell me what your definition of Zionism is and what kind of Zionist," and it becomes this long discussion about where do I fit, where do you fit, and all the rest. So it's a lot more complicated than the general discussion. So I want to thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And especially after 1948, I mean, what does that even mean? I mean, again, the only reason why, in my opinion, it still makes sense to have a term like Zionist is because there are such people called anti-Zionist, right? I mean, the whole thing is kind of foolish to some extent, because before Israel was founded, of course, it makes sense to have a term like Zionist, because these were people that were pushing for the creation of something that did not exist before. So it makes sense to have a term for that. And people who thought, no, we don't need to create this thing, it makes sense to have a term for anti these things. Once the thing is created, right, it doesn't really make sense to say, I am in favor of a movement that created this thing in the past, and that, but so Zionism ends up getting, redefined and morphed into all sorts of different things. And so you're right, in the contemporary debate, I get asked all the time by students if I'm a Zionist, and my go-to answer has become yes, but what do you mean by the question, right? In other words, like, yes, I'm, happy to say I'm a Zionist. I am by almost any definition that, one can come up with theorists, but I'm just, people just always have very specific things that they think they mean, and many of them are not actually legible. In other words, being a Zionist, of course, this is, everyone here knows this, but I just have to say it. I mean, being a Zionist says nothing about your like or dislike of any policy decisions that Israel has ever made. In other words, you can think that Israel has done incredible things or terrible things, and you can still be a Zionist on both sides, right? These are completely different, categories. It's a category error to say, I'm really upset that Israel is doing X, Y, and Z, therefore I'm an anti-Zionist, right? Like that is mixing up categories. You can say, therefore, I'm critical of the Israeli government, or I think Israel's made mistakes, but being anti-Zionist is an entirely different category of thing. So, again, in the Jewish community, I think we have to be more careful with how we define Zionist and everything. And again, it's not, in my opinion, I think, in most of the Jewish community's opinion, post 1948, being an anti-Zionist is not a legitimate position. In other words, one can be critical of Israel, right? And, we can debate how reasonable it is to be critical of Israel and, and that's a fine debate. And, of course we should be critical of Israel when it does bad things, but to think that post 1948 anti-Zionism is a legible position is just because if we take the actual definition of what it sort of, does mean historically, that would mean this person wants Israel to be destroyed, which is sort of a morally indefensible position, right? So it's a very interesting question. And yeah, I think people get that wrong all the time. And then Vardat, I see, wrote in the chat about, right, there's a big tension in terms of Israel maintaining an ethnic majority, right? And again, I think this gets into the debate between Herzl and Ahad Ha'am a little bit, but in order for political Zionism to, right, according to the dominant interpretation of political Zionism, if Israel wants to be both a Jewish and democratic state, which most of the political Zionists wanted it to be, the only way to have both of those is for Israel to control its numbers of immigration. And so, in other words, to make sure that there's a majority of Jews actually living in the state. This actually isn't so uncommon. I mean, lots of states do this in lots of ways. And so, Israel does get unique amount of pressure for doing this. It's obviously not the model we have in America, because America is one of the few examples of a country that was not built on a ethnic nationalist background, that was built on sort of a background of ideas. And so from an American perspective, it seems odd, but for most of the world, it's sort of intuitive to some extent. But yeah, Israel obviously gets, right, this obviously is a big tension in Israel of, again, what do you mean by Israel being a Jewish state, right? Everyone knows Israel's a Jewish state, right? Now, what do you mean? And again, this hinges on what is Judaism and what is Zionism, which are very complicated questions to answer. So love it. Any other thoughts or questions or anything?
I do have one question for you, Rabbi Daniel. This is a question about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Something I see online that strikes me as super anti-Semitic is when people say the Israelis are worse than the Nazis because they suffered a genocide and then went on to commit a genocide. And you would think, oh, they're just trying to be inflammatory, right? But I've seen this in discussions on Reddit where there's no Jews at all. Like, people actually think this. And I was thinking, no other ethnic minority would be analyzed this way. Like, if a Black person and a white person commit a murder, you wouldn't say it's even morally worse for the Black person because they suffered racial oppression and slavery and blah, blah, blah. So I was wondering, what do you make of that? That's it seems like a fairly common way that people analyze Israel. They think that because we suffered a genocide, I guess, I don't know, we're held to a higher standard, which it seems kind of bizarre.
Yeah, it's interesting when you put it that way. I mean, listen, it's just anti-Semitism, and how we got to the point that anti-Semitism is bad, I think, has many of its roots in, medieval Christendom, and then, in modern, 1800s and, protocols of elders of Zion. So this, strange mixture of historic Christian anti-Semitism with modern ethnic anti-Semitism, and then you have Soviet Union anti-Semitism, and, it's just some mixture of all of these that, again, one of the things, and many scholars write about this that are, study anti-Semitism, that the Jewish rejection of Jesus, it seems like a total tangent, but I promise it connects, right? Jews were seen in Christianity, and this goes back to, early Christian writers like Augustine in the 4th century, as the rejection of Jesus essentially was the Jewish rejection of anything good on earth, right? So it was Jews rejecting salvation and grace and love and all of these, and even more so, the fact that the Jews killed Jesus, again, I'm putting that in air quotes if people are not looking at me, right, mean that the Jews are antithetical to what society deems good, right? If Jesus is coming as the good force and Jews kill him, that means Jews stand on the side of evil. And this is essentially how anti-Semitic tropes have continued. It doesn't matter what the good or evil is in a society, Jews are on the evil side. So the classic example is that if communism is good, then Jews are the bankers and capitalists. If communism is bad, right, then Jews are the globalist communists, right? And so I think, again, for whatever reason, rightfully or wrongfully, we've decided in the 21st century that colonialism and white supremacy are the worst things, right? Those things are bad, granted. So of course Zionism becomes that. And if, Hitler is the worst thing you can possibly imagine, right? Especially when you're on internet forums, right? Everyone, I think there's some funny theory that, at some point something turns into, Hitler, in terms of accusations, then of course Jews become the Nazis. So I think it's just another cycle of this classic anti-Semitism. I don't know if it has specifically to do with, well, the Jews should understand better because they underwent this. I think it, because Jews were facing this before Nazi Germany in terms of the anti-Semitism. And also the other thing that I'll say, which I think is important, is that many times the modern anti-Zionists will attempt to say something like, well, Israel has power and this is a critique of power. And I think that's also unfair, because the same anti-Semitic tropes were levied at Jews when Jews had no power. So the constant is not whether Jews had power and whether the IDF existed and all that. The constant was Jews being demonized for whatever society hates the most. So it just seems like that's the constant. And so it's difficult for me to take any anti-Zionist criticism, very morally serious. Again, it's not to say there's not morally serious criticisms of Israel, but it's just not coming from groups that are talking like, how you just depicted, Michael. And so sorry if that's a very flippant and blunt answer. And, it's probably not what I would say directly if somebody, genuinely asked me, hey, I kind of, all my friends are saying this, what should I say to them? But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
No, I appreciate that. I hadn't thought of it like that. That yeah, if Hitler's the worst thing, then we're then that's what we are. So they kind of put that on us. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when racial, when having a pure race was the most important thing, Jews were obviously the worst race, in Nazi Germany, and it's constant. It's every single society, and again, a lot of this does have its legacy in the idea that the Jews killed Jesus. I mean, that's sort of it does go back to that, because that was seen as, and again, the idea, it's funny because I'll oftentimes have students ask me when I teach, this subject in history, they say, well, is it true that the Jews killed Jesus? Which I think is such a funny question, because there may be a historic question of whether or not an individual Jew killed Jesus. That's a historic question. Maybe the answer is yes, maybe it's no. But, if one person does something, you wouldn't say, well, the Jews, right? This broad category of the Jews as this collective that's existing in society that's, always trying to subvert whatever the, correct moral code is, right? That's just classic anti-Semitism. So yeah, I think the onus is on the anti-Zionists to prove why what they're saying is not anti-Semitic. The onus is not on us to prove why they are anti-Semitic. That's, obviously they don't see it like that, but I think we just have to be very clear that the onus goes in that direction. Yeah, if people need to go, feel free. I'm happy to. I can talk about this all day. Go for it.
The other thing I would just add is that genociding people is not unique to the Jewish people. Like the genociding of one group against another group is also throughout history and time, and it always involves the othering of the group that's genocided. So we know the story of our own people throughout history, but the question of why, I think you're exactly right, Rabbi, that they need to find the group to scapegoat, and it's easy to find the othering explanation. But people are as human beings, we're a pretty tough crew, and we like to kill the people that we other.
Yeah, Yeah, and I strongly, I mean, Michael, if you've never read Jabotinsky's essay, you might find it interesting, The Iron Wall, because he has a lot blunter of an approach to a lot of these questions than I think is palatable to the majority of the American Jewish community. But I think it's one of the most interesting essays that's been written, and essentially, I mean, to do my best to summarize it is, and I'm not going to do this justice because it's a long essay, and then he wrote another essay to follow it up called The Ethics of the Iron Wall, because so many people were accusing him of being immoral when he wrote this first book. But essentially, his diagnosis of human history really is that, on an international level, there really are no rules, and it really is just, you just have to be stronger than the other people. And so he says this is essentially what Israel has to be, because unlike some of the political Zionists, who their view of, once you have a state of Israel, Israel will be well respected on the global stage. In other words, there was some thought that some Zionists had where once Jews set up a state, then Jews will be respected because Jews won't be the minority anymore in other states, but Israel will just be able to assimilate into the family of nations. Jabotinsky writes, he's like, that's not going to happen. Anti-Semitism is not going anywhere. We have to essentially be ready to just continue to fight, ad infinitum. And so he ends up being a lot more right than the political Zionists on that regard in terms of his prognostication of what's actually going to happen. But yeah, it is one of those troubling things. I mean, listen, you get it on the obviously right now, we're dealing with a time when I think both the American left and the American right are brewing up their own types of anti-Semitism that are completely opposite to each other. I mean, that's the funniest thing in terms of, there's a unity between the far left and far right. They agree that they don't like some of the things that the Jews are up to, but they seem to completely disagree what those things that the Jews are up to are. And, it's like clockwork, right? The right is accusing Jews of leading to open immigration and to watering down our society and bringing in all these immigrants, and again, engaging in classic, communisty, globalisty things, whereas the left is accusing Jews of not engaging, not being universalist enough and engaging too much in particularities and, colonialism and all these things. And so it's the same thing today, where it just seems like whatever Jews do, they're going to be accused of not doing the exact opposite of the thing that they're doing. Again, there is another interesting question that we don't have to answer now because I know it's already past class time, which is, with all that said, what then is the moral onus on Jews in terms of our own self-reflection? In other words, there is a mindset that we can adopt in the Jewish community, which is, well, nobody can give us any moral, talking tos because we've been through the worst and we're always the subject of all this, terrible anti-Semitism, and so, we can't be morally criticized. That view can also probably be a little bit dangerous. So we kind of have to figure out how to do all this. And Verdun, I don't think the left and right anti-Semitism are going to absorb or cancel each other out. I think it's just, sadly, when any ideology seems to be pushed past the level of extreme, I mean, it happens in Christianity, it happens in Islam, happens in the right, it happens on the left, the second an ideology seems to be pushed. And again, I think I discussed this last time, but if not, I'll just say 2 minutes. Judaism is a particularistic tradition, which I think is off-putting to universalistic traditions, right? This is, I think, the theory of everything in terms of anti-Semitism. Universalist traditions understand other universalist traditions. In other words, Christianity and communism and Islam and, to some extent, Nazism, these are universalist traditions. In other words, they are making universal claims about what everyone should be doing or should be. And Judaism doesn't. We say, we're happy doing with what we're doing and you can do with what you're doing, and that's great. We have our own rituals and our beliefs, and you guys can exist over there, and we don't really want to bother you if you don't bother us. And I think that's weird for any ideologic movement that's, totalitarian and thinks, no, everybody should be adopting our view. Jews are always the sort of odd man out, for lack of a better term. And I think that's just led to a lot of accusations in history that Jews are, they refuse to assimilate and they're misanthropic and they have all their weird customs. And then, and that's just going to continue in every totalitarian like ideologic movements. I think anti-Semitism, so much as human psychology is geared towards, fundamentalist worldviews, I think anti-Semitism is here to stay, which again is why I think most of the Zionists were obviously borne out to be generally correct in the sense of, at the end of the day, the only thing that can really protect Jews is a Jewish state with an army and all these things. And so I'll stop talking here, but thank you all. I will see you all next Thursday. And Dara, to answer your question, yes, we'll talking a little bit about current anti-Zionism next week and such. And I will see you all soon.
Thank you. Another amazing